dork. We'll try that again. But actually, this house, we don't think we should be a temperamental little dork. And in this case, what we actually think is that Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of Fatah, should publicly come forth and claim that the war in the West Bank is regrettable, but that Hamas is at fault for starting the conflict, and that Israel's conduct in context was predictable. Now, why would he do that? I'm looking at all of your faces. The reason he would do that is because in this case it is a decisive political move to alienate Hamas and consolidate Palestinian support while gathering Israeli favor in order to generate greater political momentum for himself. So what we're going to be talking about here is how, in the context of the present struggle, it's good for Abbas and the PA politically, and essentially it's good for garnering greater favor from Israel and garnering greater actual tangible gains from Israel. So just a little primer on the present conflict. Essentially, yeah, Israel and Gaza are at war. Israel's specific aims are with Hamas, not Gaza itself. And there's a variety of hue and cry internationally regarding what's going on. That being said, in direct contrast to incidents such as the Second Intifada, when the Arab League and other Arab nations came forward, by and large publicly, and claimed that the actions of Israel were illegitimate, there's been relative silence. And what we've heard from other Arab nations is either silence, except for Syria, or claims that essentially Hamas is at fault for starting the conflict. And what we think is that Abbas should do the same thing. So why is it good for Abbas politically? Well, essentially what it does initially is it maintains its political relevance, and it essentially consolidates power around him as a legitimate and moderate leader of the Palestinian people. In context of the debate itself, I will take you in a moment, what we see is that in terms of Gazans versus those in the West Bank, there's a deep-seated political fissure that currently exists owing to the election of the Hamas government in 2006, and owing to the actions of Hamas with respect to Fatah members following that election in regards to violence and rounding up of Fatah members, and in so doing, essentially creating a rift between the two. Sir?
Sir, do you think Mahmoud Abbas can really hold on to power if he supports Israel in the wake of the pictures of thousands of Palestinians dead on Sea of Time?
Yes. Actually, we think he can, because we would say that to classify groups who have started to evolve in two different directions politically, and who have significantly different ideologies, and whose ideologies have created significant and different tangible benefits for one or the other, allow you to actually isolate the two. See, what I'm actually going to show you in discussing Israel's reaction is that the benefits garnered are going to be far more significant than what happens simply from pictures. What actually is happening in the West Bank presently is more important in terms of garnering political support, but I'll get to that. So in terms of Abbas politically, essentially his responsibility in this case is to the West Bank first, as sort of the leader, the de facto leader of those territories. And what we've seen is that under his rule, since Hamas has come along in Gaza, what we've actually seen is that essentially there have been two completely divergent policies. The policy of the Fatah government in the West Bank has been one of moderation, wherein concessions have been made to the West Bank. Israel has increased the responsibility of the PA to secure the West Bank. They've given armored vehicles to the West Bank to help the Palestinian Authority police itself, which is quite unprecedented if you think about it. They've consistently slowed and stalled construction of the wall, which we're going to discuss momentarily. And essentially, they've added more and more and more power to the hands of the PA, of Fatah, and in so doing, increased the quality of life for individuals who live in the West Bank. Now, conversely, in terms of Gaza, the policies of Hamas have been consistently and repeatedly disastrous for the individuals living there. Now, you can chalk this up to Israeli reaction, but ultimately, Israel's reaction can be seen as being completely divergent with respect to the West Bank and Gaza. And so you can't simply say one is belligerent, seeing as the divergence of policy seems to be completely related to the policies of the Palestinians. And so we would say that as such, because of this difference, there's a clear indication that more support can be garnered by essentially showing oneself to be a voice of moderation, showing oneself to be completely divergent from Hamas, and showing oneself to be looking out for the interests of one's electorate, And so we see that it's actually in the interest of Abbas to do this. Now, in terms of Israel, really quite simply, Israel feels like the walls are closing in around them. Israel feels significantly threatened, whether it be from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from Iran. There are a number of actors in the region who Israel feels are devoted, and who publicly are devoted to the destruction of that state. Now, when Israel feels threatened, I'll take you momentarily, it tends to respond predictably, and it tends to respond with essentially violence. And as such, becoming a voice of moderation has shown, in Abbas's case, to actually change this pattern of behavior, to one of concession and diplomacy, rather than diplomacy at the point of a gun. Yes, sir?
Isn't Mahmoud Abbas's formal position president of the PLO? Doesn't he represent all the Palestinians?
Yeah. Here's the thing, though. The split in 2006 between Hamas and Fatah essentially ended formally the Palestinian Authority. And so that's no longer a legitimate argument. Essentially, you have a clear political rift between the two, and so that's no longer recognized. Moreover, the election of Hamas in Gaza would say that that relationship is ended. But in terms of Israel, Israel essentially must see that, the Palestinians are moderate. Because essentially what you have to do, if you're Mahmoud Abbas, to gain more support, is essentially to garner greater support from Israel. Because Israel continues to make concessions to the Palestinian Authority. And we think that, if his ultimate goal is garnering greater support for himself from all Palestinians, or to better the West Bank specifically, either way, the buck stops with Israel. And so by showing himself to be a moderate, by showing himself not to be devoted to the sole destruction of that state, the only end result is to garner greater favor. Whether it's through the ending of the construction of the wall, or the continued dismantlement of settlements. Either way, Mahmoud Abbas gains greater support from the Israelis by showing himself to be moderate and not simply devoted to their destruction, but rather interested in the betterment of the quality of life of his people. For all of those reasons, because it's good for Mahmoud Abbas and good for the people for whom he represents, we stand in proposition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for his remarks, and invite the Leader of the Opposition to address the House for 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Thank you ever so kindly, Mr. Speaker. It's been a long time since anyone ran an Israel case on me, and I think the same is probably true of Jeremy. I'm going to make 3 arguments. I'm going to talk about why it's bad for him politically, insofar as he will be thrown out. I will then talk about why it's bad for negotiations, insofar as it means there will never be one Palestine. Finally, I'm going to talk about why it's wrong in principle, and we think Israel actually has done wrong in this conflict, before I go into talking about some refutation of what we heard. But let's start by talking about, as Jeremy raised on a POI, who Abbas is. He's the president of Palestine, of all Palestinian people, including the people in the Gaza Strip. Mr. Speaker, he isn't governing the Gaza Strip because Hamas threw him out. But the fact that the Gaza Strip is occupied by Hamas doesn't mean that he isn't responsible for the people there. We think it's a fairly fundamental principle that when the citizens of your state are being killed, you condemn that killing. And innocent civilians are being slaughtered. It is his job to condemn that, in the same way that would be true of any president in any country. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, we recognise that any conflict involving Israel and Palestine is almost necessarily a conflict that is waged in the realm of PR. We recognise that Israel is fundamentally losing that conflict globally, but being absolutely decimated in that conflict in the Middle East. If you look at the opinions of people in the Middle East, if you look at the images on Al Jazeera, if you look at the images even on BBC, ladies and gentlemen, they show hundreds and hundreds of people dying. They show mosques being hit, they show schools being hit, and they show people screaming in the streets, they show buildings burning. Ladies and gentlemen, under those circumstances, I think Israel, which gets zero sympathy at any time in the Middle East, is going to get massive negative sympathy. People are going to be disgusted with that reaction and respond accordingly. They told you the moderate governments in the Middle East have sided with Israel. True, insofar as they haven't condemned Israel. But what about the people in those countries? The governments of those countries side with Israel because they have a geopolitical interest in constraining Iran. But the people of the Middle East hate what Israel is doing and are disgusted by it. The reason those governments can't come out and stand up for Israel and say, oh no, it's perfectly legitimate, is they are terrified that that will result in them being thrown from power. That's certainly true in Palestine as well. Insofar as the Gaza and the West Bank are not two separate entities. Though there's that political split, people have family in each other, right? They were part of the same country. And so when your brothers and your sisters and your uncles are being bombed, when they're being starved, I think it's going to be reasonable to suggest that people are going to be very unhappy with a leader who doesn't condemn that killing and doesn't say it's wrong. This will be the end of Mahmoud Abbas's career. He's already been criticised for being too lenient on Israel, and he does Israel no good if he's thrown from office. This would be foolish. Secondly, I want to talk about his role as a negotiator, because we think there is hope for Palestine being reunited, right? Insofar as the purpose of all the diplomacy and of the Israeli blockade has been to try and alienate Hamas, so that Fatah can once again become the ruling body in all of Palestine, right? If there's ever going to be a two-state solution, if there's ever going to be a functional Palestinian state, it's going to be much stronger if it includes both of those territories. If there's ever going to be a peace settlement, the Palestinians are in a much stronger negotiating position if they're talking from both of those territories, because you're a larger group of people, and because you can offer Israel a more comprehensive peace plan. Under those circumstances, we think it should be the objective of Fatah to try and unify the people. You're not going to be able to do that if when half of them were being slaughtered, you said it's okay. Regardless of whether it's okay or not, the people in Gaza do not think it's okay, and will never think it's okay, and will never forgive Fatah, and will never forgive Abbas for taking that position. But we did think that political reconciliation was actually a possibility, right? Insofar as if Israel moderates, if Israel starts to treat Hamas like reasonable people, that massively undermines Hamas. Things like recognition of Hamas could go a long way towards dealing with that problem, and ultimately we think that's sort of the road that you should be taking. If that succeeds, then Fatah will be in the position of saying, look, we negotiated, Israel's reasonable, let's talk about it instead of that. Finally, I want to talk about why this is wrong in principle, because we don't actually think Israel's blameless, we don't actually think Hamas has acted all that unreasonably. Because it's not just like Hamas started firing missiles, Hamas has been starved, the people of Gaza have been starved ever since they were elected.
Sorry, so what you're actually suggesting to solve it, rather than condemning Hamas for Fatah, you actually think that the way to solve this is for Israel to actually just recognize Hamas?
No, I'm not arguing for that. I'm just saying that that would be something that could be part of a broader peace plan. All I'm saying is Abbas should do what he's doing now, and say, stop shooting each other. We think that should be his statement, rather than the Hamas is at fault, Israel is wonderful. Okay, so why is this wrong in principle? We think it's wrong in principle because ever since Hamas was elected, the people of Gaza have been collectively punished by Israel. Since Hamas took power, which was not something the Gazans wanted, right? I think the Gazan people didn't ask for a civil war in Palestine. They just said, we want Hamas because they're not corrupt. We want Hamas because they'll actually provide with social services. We say that was a legitimate democratic decision that they made. But they're being punished for making that democratic decision. They're being starved. They're being denied access to the world economies through an Israeli blockade. So people were dying through lack of medical supplies. People were dying through lack of food. And people were living in insufferable poverty. We say, under those circumstances, it is legitimate that any state should try and fight to protect itself. When you're being blockaded, you fight against the blockading power because the Gaza Strip had been turned into a de facto prison, and this government has the responsibility to try and escape. The only way Hamas can do that is by shooting rockets at Israel, because they don't have tanks and they don't have jets. Hamas are dicks, we agree, but ultimately they were doing something we think is fundamentally reasonable to try and protect a state. The Israelis were at fault too. The first argument we heard is this will help Abbas politically because it will show he's a voice of moderation. Ladies and gentlemen, it will show he's a stooge of Israel. Whether he is or not, that is how he will be perceived. And at that point he becomes useless to you because he's no longer a moderate voice saying, I represent Palestine, but I represent Palestine in a way that's perfectly reasonable. He's now someone who's just saying, I'm on the Israeli side. At that point he loses any credibility with the rest of the Palestinian people. He loses power and he loses the ability to be useful to the Israelis. So I don't even think the Israelis want him to do this. He also told you that it's like otherwise he becomes politically irrelevant and Hamas dictates the agenda. Insofar as they may be shouting, that's true. But I think a reasonable, calm voice of moderation can come over that, and that's exactly the role he should be trying to take. He should be trying to play that role of mediator. Finally, we heard this will get you more favour from Israel. And then they give you a list of all the things Israel has already given him, like money and tanks and helicopters and guns and all that sort of stuff, which he's already been given without doing that. So I think in the first case, like all the benefits you described already exist. I don't know what else Israel's going to give him. They can't stop settling because then they're going to be the government's going to be thrown out of power, right? So that's probably not an option. Furthermore, Israel supports him because he's not trying to kill them, not because he's in their corner cheering for them. We think they have America for that. We think they can do that themselves. Ultimately, they just want him to stay in power because so long as he's in power, the PLO isn't going to try and kill Israelis. That's all they want out of him. So they want him to survive politically, that's far more important for them than having a cheering squad. We stand proudly in opposition.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks and invite the Minister of the Crown to address the House. Hear, hear.
Okay, yeah, so I'm quaking my boots a little bit. They've done Israel a lot. But fundamentally, what they've shown in their speech is that they understand the fundamental problem in the Middle East. And in lots of contexts of politics, when you have a radical public and a voice of moderation that's necessary from government in the context of democracy. Because you continually have, post-spring eternal in Palestine, that violent reaction towards Israel will be the thing that gets changed, despite decades and decades, and wars in 48, 56, 67, 73, 82, 06, and 09 that have proven the opposite. So this is the problem. The problem is, how can a democratically elected leader convince his public that the voice of moderation is what's required, and can he reason with the public that is outraged, as we know, by the scenes on Al Jazeera? And they're right. In general, like, Israel's not looking at its best right now. We think it is, however, looking better than it ever has before while conducting war against part of the Palestinian people. So that is the issue, and we're going to argue about why Abbas can do this and can succeed in power. And I think fundamentally their idea was that they could misconstrue Casey saying Abbas is like, yes, Israel, like, when can I sign up for this, like the reserves? No, the idea is that you explain that the conflict was predictable, which it completely was, and you explain that the reaction, well, regrettable because it's war and because Palestinians, who yes are like the brotherhood of the fraternity, I should not use sexist words, the people of Palestinians, it's a tragedy in the sense that it's pointless. That is the tragedy of this conflict. We think people can see that. We think, like, fundamentally, what Richard missed in his speech was that he's pretending the way that Israel has to, that all Gazans are in favor of what's currently happening, and that each day and by this I mean he's suggesting that Hamas solidarity. You don't need to show it, sir, by the way. You can just raise text down like everyone else. That Hamas and its people are one. We think when the people are at war, and its government has gotten into that war, each and every day when they wake up and more rockets are falling, they wonder, how did this mess happen? And we do think that, although in the moment of war, people are not prone to being completely reasonable, once the media blanket ends, once more and more of what's going on and how Israel's been talking about this conflict, and how the rest of the world, including the leaders of Egypt and Jordan, which have usually been very, very favorable to Palestinian violence towards Israel, once all of this, the fog of war ceases, we do think Gazans are reasonable people. Gazans themselves could have predicted it. And furthermore, in terms of whether Israel's reaction is justified, Richard said they voted for Hamas because they wanted humanitarian support. We think that's the common Western line. It's partially true. They also voted for Hamas as a democratic government because Hamas promised to pursue what's in its charter, which is the destruction of Israel, the sea to the river kind of thing, the rhetoric that Palestinian leaders have always given to their people, the rhetoric that's proven once again to be brutal for Palestinians because of the sheer geopolitical realities of how much force there is. We would say, in a historical sense, and this is a new point if you want, when the Arab nationalists were around and they were Palestinian government in 1948 when Israel was founded, they said debt to Israel because it's they sensed colonization and all the reasons that they have a legitimate grievance. That moderated over 30 years to the point where they were like, the only way forward, the only way to have stability that my partner talked about, which is what's happening in West Bank, concessions from Israel, equality of life, is to moderate. What happened then? 50s, 60s. Fatah rises, Yasser Arafat is bomb Israel, kill them, whatever. That moderates towards the 90s. Oslo peace process, they're the only way forward is this thing. So why is the pattern different this time? Because Hamas has risen because Fatah moderated. We see that. Some people in Gaza and Palestine in general are really pissed about it, and they're like, we should kill Israel. Some people are saying we should probably just try and coexist because we've lost every single time. So the thing is, why is this different? Because the policies that the people voted for, the policies that they chose and their leaders promised them, have proven to be utterly disastrous, to put it lightly. We say this moment in the history of Palestine has shown that choosing to fight Israel again and again, and yet on a clear alternative that's not being bombed in Ramallah, despite some protests, overall things are pretty good there compared to Gaza, shows Palestinians the choice that they have, and shows that there's a potential for solidarity between Palestinians and their people. The point isn't being Israel's, I'll take you in a moment, flunkies. The point is recognizing what the limits of force can do when all you have, as Richard said in his own speech, are a few unaimable rockets that you can target at cities in the face of overwhelming military superiority. Yes?
The world was ignoring the fact that Israel was slowly starving the Gaza Strip to death. Surely Hamas had to do something to try and save that.
They were starving Hamas, and yes, like sanctioning a government to get rid of the government is a common problem. Like, if you want to get rid of the government, the idea that people can separate Hamas is the problem and we Gazans are not being targeted for some kind of ethnic cleansing idea or whatever you're saying. Like, yes, it's inflammatory, and yes, Hamas had to react because that's their whole thing was being belligerent. But nonetheless, Gazans themselves weren't attacked. Like, although they were suffering, Hamas was being attacked. I think that people can see the distinction, particularly when passions do cool down somewhat. So, I've given you my new constructive point, which is the pattern of the need for change and the fact that right now Palestinians can see that there's two different alternatives and that one has been disastrous and that one is decent. So to get into a rebuttal of Richard's speech, first of all, of course, he misrepresented their case and said that this statement is anything more than the fact that this is predictable and that the idea that people in Palestine, because of their rage and because they're watching Al Jazeera, couldn't access this fact, which we do think is a fact. Like, it was totally predictable. Israel was threatening it. People voted for them nonetheless, and this happened. We do think that's a reasonable stance and that people can see it. And like a second point is, in terms of what is democracy, and is democracy functioning in the West Bank and Gaza, despite all of the irregularities of the states and their sort of semi-apartheid nature, as the media is calling it. The fact is, in democracy, what you have, like according to like anybody, is public reason giving. The public proposal of a plan that the government will implement, implementation of that plan, the evaluation of that plan, and the possibility of change. Is that pattern still possible? Like, has a democratic choice been made to attack Israel and have the results been seen? We say yes. What naturally happens at that point is that people reevaluate. They're not, Hamas and Gaza are not coterminous. Hamas and Gaza are together between elections in the way that in every other government may carry a policy, the policy is unpopular, there's potential for change. So the big question from Richard's speech was, like, will Abbas be useless to Israel? Will Abbas be useless to Palestinians? We would say fundamentally no, because the statement is fairly moderate and the statement is reasonable. Like, the idea of a just war being based on provocation and reaction and the minimization of civilian casualties, we know that many Palestinians don't want to hear it. The tragedy of 1,000 people and like 300 children among them dying is a huge tragedy, which means people aren't willing to listen for political reasons necessarily right now. Some of them never will be. But we do think that overall, there's a potential to recognize that what happened was predictable and that it's not a viable solution the way it hasn't been for the last, like, since 1948. How many years that is? So that's what, 61 years of conflict. So Richard also said that there's no hope because, essentially because of the misidentification and the conflating of Israel, of Hamas and Gaza. We would say Gazans are split. Gazans have, that is to say, Hamas has a government in Damascus and Jordan where its leaders can fly around the world and enjoy like modern conveniences. It has a government in Gaza. The government in Gaza is like, please sue for peace right now. The government in Damascus is like, we're radicals. This is our ideological bench. We'll never compromise. There is a split among Hamas, which already suggests that its political power is waning by the fact that it's fractured. There's a potential for Hamas to also, to not see itself, because for the basic fact that Hamas is former Fatah members who have chosen a political route to try and seek a political fruit, and that is not been forthcoming. So that point change occurs. We think that right now the polis of Palestine and its leaders are on the same page, and that Hamas has a future in Palestine in this way.
Thank the Minister of the Crown for his remarks and invite the member of the opposition to address the House. Here.
Sorry, I'm just going to try to make Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the government for a very nice history lesson that was mostly right, but not very argumentative. I'm going to break it down to reality, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to return to why Mahmoud Abbas can't do this and shouldn't do this in 3.5 constructive points. The first thing I'm going to get into is Hamas and the West Bank, because they described the West Bank and Gaza as these sort of homogenous entities, and they're not. Secondly, I'm going to talk about Hamas as a PR king and how they're going to spin this statement. And thirdly, I want to talk about what happens in the endgame if Hamas is completely destroyed or they're not completely destroyed, i.e. either scenario of this conflict. So firstly, Hamas and the West Bank. We seem to have described as Hamas is the only party in Gaza, and West Bank is the only party in, and Fatah is the only party in the West Bank. That's just not true. There are huge internecine rivalries in each territory, Mr. Speaker. What you have is one group has emerged predominant in each territory, but Mahmoud Abbas faces a real threat from Hamas in the West Bank, and you can see that through his daily repressive activities against the party. They've reached, in the past few months, they've reached sort of I don't want to call it a truce, but an equilibrium, Mr. Speaker. This statement would upset that, Mr. Speaker, infuriate every member of Hamas, every Hamas sympathizer in the West Bank, and create massive internal dislocations for Mahmoud Abbas. He might face an internal revolt, Mr. Speaker, something he can't face in the wake of his waning popularity. Secondly, I want to talk about Mahmoud Abbas as a strong negotiator, Mr. Speaker. Because if Assad government is right, if this is something to give to Israel, we believe that you should get something in return. Because unlike Assad government's assertions, Mr. Speaker, Israel hasn't been quite as forthcoming in its agreements, especially the one with George Bush and Annapolis a little over a year ago, where they promised to stop further settlement development and they promised to remove impediments at checkpoints, which they have done neither, Mr. Speaker. Palestinians on the ground in West Bank see this. Those checkpoints are what causes the daily hardships and repression for them. If you want to make a step towards giving something to Israel, towards being a conciliator, people in the West Bank want to see that you've gotten something in exchange, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing in their plan that hints that you will get this, Mr. Speaker. And internal Israeli politics, with the rise of Netanyahu, suggests that you're not going to get this anytime soon, Mr. Speaker. If you want to remain strong in the West Bank, then you have to fight for every concession, not just give them up. No, thank you. Secondly, Hamas is a public relations king, because you've seen them time and time again spinning the war in their interest, Mr. Speaker. You've seen that in their use of civilians, Mr. Speaker. You've seen that in their use of journalists, in the pictures of dead Palestinians, Mr. Speaker, in how they talk to the world, and in how they frame their conflict. Now, this is certainly sympathetic on the BBC, but I can guarantee you it's more sympathetic on Al Jazeera. And I can guarantee you it plays stronger to an audience in the West Bank who experienced the same thing only 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker. They're ripe for the picking, Mr. Speaker, and Hamas will take Mahmoud Abbas' statement to spin it as a complete endorsement of Israel and only further this revolt that I talked about in my first point, Mr. Speaker. Mahmoud Abbas won't have time for negotiating with Israel. He'll have a civil war at his doorstep. And thirdly, and most importantly, I'll take you after this point, so I'll take you in a little bit. I want to talk about the end game, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about the two different scenarios, which I have on a piece of paper I left on my desk. The first scenario, Mr. Speaker, is that Hamas is completely destroyed. Israel wins, Mr. Speaker. But what will this look like? Firstly, this will take several months. It will have mass civilian casualties that we've already started to see line up. You'll have months of armed, boots on the ground, IDF raids into Gaza, Mr. Speaker. You'll have months of food and fuel shortages, Mr. Speaker. Everyone will have lost a mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, or have a friend who died in the conflict, Mr. Speaker. This and the infrastructure of the Strip will be destroyed. This is not a territory that's ripe for picking for Fatah to come in and say, we said it was okay, guys, but you should vote for us now, Mr. Speaker. This is a territory that's ripe to create a new revolutionary group, Mr. Speaker. Or, in the case that Fatah stood up for their interest, for them to come in and say, listen, this was completely wrong for Israel to do, let us represent you and sue for peace. Secondly, what happens if Hamas is not destroyed, which we believe is the more likely result, Mr. Speaker? See Lebanon, Mr. Speaker, and see Round 6 that we debated yesterday. Firstly, that was, you guys supposed to be funny, but that was didn't work. What happens if Hamas is not destroyed? You'll see an increased repression of Fatah, Mr. Speaker. Because as much as Hamas hates Fatah now, they will hate them even more if they ally with Israel against them, Mr. Speaker. You'll see a consolidation of power of Hamas, and you'll see no ability, as Richard told you, to negotiate and form a united Palestine, which is the only way you get to a two-state solution in the future. Now I'll take it.
Okay, given all of the reminders of the horrible conflict that are currently in Gaza, isn't it the prudent time for Fatah to say, look where Hamas's policies have brought in Palestinians and the cause for liberation and cause for independence in territory?
The problem is, if you say, look at what Hamas has done, you're basically saying, you're basically justifying Israel's action. That's the problem, right? I've given you Hamas's PR spin, but you don't need to go that far. You're saying Hamas deserved what they're getting, is what your statement says, Mr. Speaker. But what they're getting is deaths of civilians, they're getting bombings of schools, Mr. Speaker, they're getting raids of apartment buildings, they're getting UN centers being blown up, Mr. Speaker. To say that a Hamas militant is being killed is okay is iffy, Mr. Speaker. To say Israel's response is correct, Mr. Speaker, is outrageous, especially to your own citizens, Mr. Speaker. Speaker. They give you a point, Mr. Speaker, really one point, which is you need to be a moderate. But I just want to talk quickly about what a moderate is, Mr. Speaker. Because a moderate is someone who stands up for their own people in a reasonable fashion. A moderate is someone who doesn't advocate violence, Mr. Speaker. But a moderate is not someone who abandons the people that elected them to office, Mr. Speaker, or the people who voted their constituency that they represent, Mr. Speaker, as Richard told you about. A moderate is someone who says, let's implement a ceasefire, Mr. Speaker. A moderate is someone who sues for peace. A moderate is not someone, Mr. Speaker, who says it's okay to have an armed retaliation against our own citizens. It's okay to bomb civilian schools, Mr. Speaker. It's okay to carry out these raids with massive civilian collateral damage, Mr. Speaker. And a moderate is not someone who isolates everyone in Gaza. They said we've lumped everyone in Gaza together as a Hamas sympathizer. We've done the exact opposite. We've said we've said Gaza is a heterogeneous place where people supported Gaza. They supported Gaza for Hamas for a lack of corruption, or they didn't support Hamas at all. None of those civilians deserve to be the target of Israeli military might, Mr. Speaker. And Abbas, if he says anything, needs to say that. We beg.
Thank you, Member Dale, for his remarks, and invite
Sorry, flights to make.
and invite Leader of the Opposition to address.
I wasn't aware my last speech was that bad. I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, Abbas politically, because that's the case, and then we're going to talk about negotiation and peace and why this basically screws you over. But I think we can summarise the government's case as this. There is fighting going on, and lots of people are dying, and people are upset by it. Our objective should be to try and blame it on Hamas. But that's not going to work. You're just going to get blamed yourself. Because if you think about any conflict, ladies and gentlemen, any conflict at all, what happens when people start to die is people don't say, we blame our own government. They say, we blame the guy doing the killing. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, during World War II, people were being killed in huge numbers, and everyone was really upset about that. But they didn't say, that damn Winston Churchill with his hard-ass policies towards Germany. They said, we hate the Germans. And ultimately, it doesn't matter who's actually responsible. The person who killed your brother is the one who blamed, not the person who antagonized the person who killed your brother. Ultimately, geopolitics and the nuance of the situation is totally beside the point. People rally around the flag. That's what happens during conflicts. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Ultimately, Hamas will say the following. They will say, Israel is wrong. Israel was collectively punishing you for expressing your democratic right. They will say, Israel was blockading you and starving you for exercising your democratic right. And they will say, Israel has killed 1,000 civilians in response to 10 deaths. Whether they're right or wrong is irrelevant. The point is, they'll look like they're right to the people who are being killed. And at that point, Abbas is finished. Government relied on the Palestinian people being extremely rational and detached, taking a huge step back from the conflict, a step back that I don't think I can take, I don't think you can take, because you've seen the pictures on the news. He's asking the Palestinian people to take that step back and say rationally, yes, the geopolitical nuance of what Hamas was doing was dangerous. I say they're not going to do that, because they've never done that before, and the Israelis have never done that, and I can think of no people in history who have ever done that in a conflict, so ultimately, that's just not realistic. I say, in fact, they're the least likely people to ever do that, because they've been in this conflict for generations. For generations, they've been killing each other's brothers and sisters and fathers. For generations, the people in the West Bank have faced that same sort of conflict. As Jeremy told you, this doesn't just scupper unity for Palestine. This doesn't just mean Fatah's dead forever in the West Bank. It means Abbas is gone now because suddenly Hamas in the West Bank is saying, look, your uncle was just killed, and he says it's just fine. I know he's not saying it's just fine, but that's what they'll make it sound like, and suddenly he has no political leg to stand on. I also think we needed to hear a better response to our analysis about negotiation of peace. Because we recognise that in the long run, even if you buy that Abbas will be fine in the West Bank, he's going to need to regain some credibility in the Gaza Strip eventually. Or Fatah's going to have to regain some credibility there eventually. And this makes it very hard because of what I've already talked to you about. Ultimately, Palestine has to be unified if it's going to get a good peace deal. Ultimately, that's what Israel wants from Abbas. They want him to shut up and say, killing is wrong, stop killing. That's how you look like a moderate, as Jeremy said, by taking the impartial ground and just saying, the death toll must end. That's what Israel wants him to do, that's what his people want him to do, and that's what will make him a lasting peacemaker. We stand proud of the opposition.
Thank you, the opposition, and invite the Prime Minister to address the House for a final 3-minute rebuttal. Hear, hear.
Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So, in context of what we're discussing today, as mentioned and as mentioned by side government and essentially ignored by side opposition, we're talking in context of a Palestinian people who are going to an election post-conflict. It's right around the corner, and what we're essentially saying on this side of the House is that the Palestinian people are reasonable and are able to see what the results of policies are. What's being told to you by side opposition is that nuance is beyond the average person when they're grieving or otherwise, and that essentially people can't see the result of the actions of their government. We would say on this side of the House that we give far more credit to the Palestinian people. So, what we'd like to ask is when Palestinians vote in their own self-interest, what will they do if what we're discussing on this side of the House is actually followed through with? Palestinian people will look at their territories. And the Palestinian people will see a Gaza in ruins, and they will see a West Bank that is impeccable. They will see a Gaza, comparatively, yeah. They'll see a Gaza that is bombed and suffering enormous casualties, and they'll see a West Bank with a continually increasing GDP and increased concessions from Israel that you can only get more of. What they'll see is a situation where one governmental policy of violence has time and again and again and again led to violent Israeli reprisals and hardline Israeli political tactics, whereas an opposing voice of moderation has led to concessions, acceptance, and a change and variation in the political climate. That's what the voice of moderation does. For Mahmoud Abbas to isolate Hamas in this situation, for Mahmoud Abbas to come forth and say, what Hamas is doing is directly leading to casualties in the Gaza Strip is not over the heads of the Palestinian people. It is not too nuanced for them to understand. All they simply have to do is look at the West Bank in comparison. Because ultimately, all you need here is predictability. That's what this is all about. Israel's behavior has time and again been predictable. Hamas's behavior has time and again been predictable. And the behavior of the of Fatah has yet to be sorted out. This kind of behavior of moderation, changes the pattern of violence that has existed in the situation for nigh on 60 years. It changes the pattern of violence and hatred, followed by reprisals, to one of moderation that has led to concessions. And so, what ultimately we have to ask here is what's in the best interest of Mahmoud Abbas? Because what happens for Mahmoud Abbas by isolating Hamas, by showing himself to be a voice of reason, by showing himself to be a man that can get the Israelis to the table, means that he is the man to lead the Palestinian people. He is the man to overcome the rifts that do exist. He is the man to overcome the cycle of violence. Because ultimately, the man that wins the hearts of Israelis is the man that's going to win the hearts of Palestinians, because he's going to be the man that wins independence and concessions for his people, and for those reasons,
I thank the Prime Minister for his remarks, and both sides for a fine debate, inviting across the floor.